Welcome to Sovereignty in Action. I'm your host, Ian Record. I'm honored to be joined today by Mr. Gil Vigil, who's president of the board of directors of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, and he also serves as executive director of the 8 Northern Indian Pueblos Council Incorporated. Gil, good to have you with us today.
Thank you. Good morning.
I shared a little bit about who you are, but why don't you start out by just telling us a little bit more about yourself? What did I leave out?
You left out a whole bunch. I am from the Pueblo of Tesuque, and I'm a former governor. I served as at our tribal council as governor, and by virtue of that, I'm a lifetime council member. We are still a traditional government. We are appointed by the elders, and so I didn't run for the position. I was appointed by the elders. My first term was in 1990 and 92. We served a one-year term, 1992, 2000, and the last one was 2006. So I'm a council member by that. I'm also involved with education, and more recently with not recent, but with Indian child welfare and just healthcare issues also.
So before we dive into our main topic discussion, can you provide us with just a brief overview of Tesuque? Tell us about your Pueblo, its people, its land, its culture, for those who may not know much about it.
Okay. Tesuque Pueblo is located 10 miles north of Santa Fe, an hour from Albuquerque, if you want to kind of geographically identify where we're at. Our reservation is well, we're not reservation, we're land assignment. We're different because we were never removed from our homelands. It's just our land base shrunk to what they are today. Like I said, we're 12 miles north of Santa Fe, and we still consider Santa Fe our suburb, only because that was one of our original pueblos also. And history has it that our pueblo, there was 9 pueblos starting from Santa Fe all the way into Cuñamongue. Of course, the other 8 pueblos, and Santa Fe included, have now no longer exist. And so the pueblo that we're at, and like I said, it's called Tesuque, but its pronunciation has changed from the original name of Tesuque, which means a place where the row of trees are at. So that's the traditional official name of our pueblo. We're not a big pueblo. I think our total population is probably like 801, because we had a birth just recently. So we're a very small community. But the land grant is, I don't exactly know how big it is, but what important part about our community is we were involved had an important role in the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, in that the revolt, I think, was scheduled probably on August 13, and I was thinking that August 13 that year might have been on a Friday. So the runners were going out from different pueblos, and of course our runners were going from Tesuque, and when they run, they were carrying a leather strap or a strap that had knots tied on it, and each day they would untie the knot, signifying how many days were left before the revolt started. Well, on August 9th, the 2 runners went to a pueblo in San Cristobal, it's called, in near Pecos, New Mexico. When they got there, they were informed their governor of that pueblo was on his way to tell the Spanish governor, Otomain, that this revolt was going to take place. So not to lose the element of surprise, the pueblo decided we strike the first blow tomorrow. And so on August 10th, Tesuque struck the first blow, killed the priest that was there and the soldiers that were there, and then the runners spread out and just went out there. The significant part about this story is the 2 runners, Gatu and Amtua, were sent back to the other pueblos, but by the time they were sent out, the Spanish governor, had got information about the 2 young men. So they were captured, tortured, and eventually executed. So they were the first casualties of war, I guess, at the time.
So that's a really interesting history, and I assume it's one that you guys go to great lengths in the year 2015 to continue to impart to your young people?
This event we enact the Pueblo Revolt run every year. The past few years, we actually ran a relay race from Tesuque into Santa Fe. One year, about maybe 4 years ago, we ran into Santa Fe, and the mayor of Santa Fe welcomed us into the Santa Fe city. And I tell this story about the significance of the run, and I there's a cross in Santa Fe on top of the hill. It's called the Cross of the Martyrs, which represents the priests that were killed in the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. So that day when I was telling this story, I says, wouldn't it be great if we had a monument up on the same hill for the two runners that were executed and gave their life first? And the mayor said, Governor, why don't we name, and we were in the Civic Plaza. They built a new Civic Center, and we're in the plaza. And he says, Governor, why don't we dedicate this plaza to the two runners? And I said, great. Of course, he didn't run for re-election because a new mayor came in, but the new mayor also, the next year, actually dedicated the plaza by proclamation and named it the Tecatu Amtua Plaza. The following year, I think it was last year, they actually put a plaque in the plaza signifying. So now we're going to try and find somebody to build two statues of the runners to place in there. But this is the significance of our and we teach this to our young people, because and they're proud of this history. And there's other history that we could talk about Tesuque itself. But.
So let's talk about young people of Tesuque, young Native people across the country, and specifically the Indian Child Welfare Act. But before we get into the particulars of ICWA, which is the acronym for the act, tell us why this issue for you. How and why did you come to serve as the executive? How did you come to serve as the president of the board of directors of the National Indian Child Welfare Association?
Thank you for that question, because that itself also is a story, but I'll make it short. I became Indian Child Welfare, involved with Indian Child Welfare around during the time when the act was probably passed. And the way that came about was I was working with the Santa Fe Indian School at the time, and the governor of my pueblo said, I need help in the education department because that's my expertise, I guess, if you will. And he asked me, can you come back and run our education program? And so I accepted, and I went back to my pueblo to run the education program. But also during that time, he also said there are monies available through the Bureau of Indian Affairs for social services and Indian child welfare. And can you write a proposal to see if we can get that funding 638 those programs? And I said, so I wrote a grant, and we were successful. So we got the social service grant and we got the Indian child welfare grant. And since we didn't have a social service department, he said to me, well, now you're going to be the education/social service /ICWA director. So that's how I got involved in it. And then New Mexico had an Indian Child Welfare Association. And it was kind of faltering. It was not going well. So one day I got invited to this meeting, and I attended the meeting. And next thing I knew, I came out of there being the president of the New Mexico Indian Child Welfare Association. And then so we started to reactivate the association, and we started going again, and we started meeting, and we actually started having our own state conferences, and we were pretty strong with Indian child welfare issues at that point. And then somebody from the national level, I guess, heard about us in New Mexico and invited us to one of their conference in Reno, Nevada, and at the national conference, and they invited us to do a presentation just to show what we did and how we reactivated our association. So then we went to the conference and we made our presentation. Next thing I know, somebody nominated me to the national board. So I think it was 1997 that I became a member of the National Child Welfare Association. And I've been on the board, and so all through those years we talked about the issues and concerns about NCAI. And then in 2012, our then president, Maurice Lyons, who had not passed on, was our president, and he became ill. So one day he calls me and tells me, Gil, I need your help. And I said, sure, how can I help you? He says, I need for you to be the president of NCAI. And I told him, well, sir, I am really humbled and honored that you're asking me, but don't we have a vice president that should step in? And he said, well, it was me and him talked about it, and we felt that you should be the one to lead this organization. And then I said, well, again, we have other board members. Maybe they're interested in this position. So they put out the word throughout the board, and in January of 2013, at our first meeting of the year that we meet in Portland, I was elected president of NCAI, and the rest of the board, I guess, felt that I was the individual to assume that role. Of course, the biggest issue at that point was the Baby Veronica case that came up in January when the Supreme Court decided to take the case. So it was a challenging year because of that case itself. But I think we went through it, and the bad thing about it is that I feel that injustice was done on Indian child welfare by the Supreme Court.
So you mentioned that you've been involved with this issue, Indian child welfare, and then the implementation of the act itself, so basically since its beginning. And if you think back to that time, the late 70s, when the Indian Child Welfare Act was legislated, it became law. Why was it necessary? Why was that act necessary?
Well, it was necessary because Indian children were being taken away from their communities and their homes and their families by individuals and like the adoption agencies that were out there. And of course, if you look at history, a lot of our kids were taken away early in history, the boarding school era. And so from that point on until the time that Indian Child Welfare Act was passed or was thought of, those issues were already happening. Indian children were being taken away for various reasons or reasons that were not appropriate to remove kids from their communities. And one of the things I think that they were doing was, again, the genocide that took place, the assimilation era, all these things that they were trying to kill the Indian, save the man concept, the policies that were being passed during those times. So it was predicated on those issues, I think, was the reason that Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, to protect our children from being taken away illegally, basically, or sold by adoption agency, because that was a big business, which it is still today.
So one of the other tenets of the Indian Child Welfare Act, and in terms of its, in terms of the motivation behind it, deals with not just saving the child and keeping that child in the community, but sustaining the tribe, sustaining the tribe for the future. Can you talk a little bit more about that aspect and why it's so critical?
Well, we always say our youth are our future leaders, and that's the whole premise about this act, is that we want to preserve our traditions and our culture. The history I talked about at Tesuque Pueblo, some of those events that took place that we should be recognizing, honoring, and teaching our children about who they are, where they come from, their tribe, their communities, their cultures, their tradition, and some of the issues that we talked about here at this conference this week about the preservation of that. And so it's important for us to protect our children so that they have something that we had in our own generations, and it's their responsibility now. We've come to this point, and we brought our organization, our tribes to this level. Now we can train and teach our children so they can continue that legacy, and that's why it's so important.
So the Indian Child Welfare Act is passed back in the late 1970s. It's been nearly 40 years since it became law. Why is it still necessary? Haven't things changed, or do the issues remain very much the same?
Sad to say, the issues remain the same, only because I think the intent of the law has never been truly implemented. They have really never been, people that are involved, I think, have really never understood the Indian Child Welfare Act, they're interpreted it what they think it is. So because of that, a lot of judges, court systems, attorneys, especially because to me, it's selling of our kids again. And so they don't want to use the act because it hinders their process. So they're not going to do anything else to implement the act itself. So the few years that the years that the Indian Child Welfare Act has been in place, there's also the guidelines. And the guidelines have never been changed since the inception of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And those guidelines are basically to assist the state of how do you implement Indian child welfare. But they have not done that either. So it's more important today, this generation, that we start developing those or amending the guidelines to let the states know this is the responsibility, this is your responsibility.
So can you talk a bit about where Tesuque stands on this issue in terms of its efforts to make sure that ICWA is enforced? What has its experience been like trying to ensure that states and the state of New Mexico and the counties that that surround you are living up to the spirit of the law.
Right. Um, like I said, Tesuque is a very small community, and I don't think we've really had an equal case in itself. But being the executive director of 8 Northern, I've seen equal cases in other communities. Um, we do have individuals that were adopted out early in life, like now they're probably like in 70, 60, that are coming back because they're finding their way back home. Of course, in the day, they sealed the adoption so they didn't know who their biological parents were. But now that they lax that, I think a lot of people are coming back to find their community back to their pueblos. But for currently, right now, the problem we see in our communities are the local agency governments, the county governments, that are not aware of the Indian Child Welfare Act, so they're not implementing it. The state itself, I think, is implementing the process where they identify the kids as a native. They send out information to the communities and say, is this your Indian child? And then, of course, even that process, I think, is tainted because when I was governor, and I got a list of kids, and they asked me, are these your kids? And I give it to our enrollment committee, and they tell me, no, they are not our kids. So then I pass it on. And so I think a lot of the kids were falling through the system because of that, because they were not identified by a particular pueblo or a tribe in New Mexico. So those are the obstacles I think that we still have today. But in Tesuque, we really don't have a case that I felt that we lost any of our children to the system. An example I'll use is one of the pueblos did have 4 boys, I think, brothers. The 2 boys were placed in a native home, and the county was, I think, trying to place the other 2 brothers, separated them to begin with, the other 2 brothers into different families. When the first family, the 2 boys were in, made their intent that they wanted the 2 brothers also. And so eventually I think what happened was the 2 boys were put into different homes, but I think the outcome finally was that they were brought back and made a full family again. So these are some of the things that are happening.
But unfortunately, I think you hear of instances where that scenario unfolds and the reunion of siblings does not occur. I mean, isn't that a huge issue? It's not just separating a native child from his or her tribal culture. It's often separating a native child from his siblings.
Right.
And so it's not. So then the challenge becomes not just reuniting that child with his or her tribe. It's trying to make that family whole again.
Exactly, and that's one of the biggest issues I think we have at NCAI is these kids that are being separated and put in place in different homes, and they lose that identity or the connection as a family, and it goes back to the community lifestyle. So now they're growing up in one area somewhere else, and the other one's going somewhere else. So those are the things we want to try to keep the kids all together and try to put them in the same home, but it's not an easy job.
So. How about nationally? You said that because of the small size of Tesuque that there aren't a lot of equal cases. How are you seeing this play out nationally? Obviously, it's gotten a lot of press. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of the opposition to ICWA is extremely aggressive mm-hmm. and extremely well financed, mm-hmm. And they're perpetrating a lot of misconceptions about. Right. And falsehoods, frankly, about the act and its intent and how it's being used and why it's being used. Can you comment just on what the national landscape looks like, where you see the real trouble areas and how, and maybe dispel some of those misconceptions?
Yeah, well, I think it differs from state to state. Some states have a good relationship, but even with the good relationship, there are still issues. Some states are blatantly not even adhering to the Indian Child Welfare Act, and the social service programs within states, child care services within state are just going out, grabbing the kids without having a true reason to take them or remove them from their homes. And like you were saying, and there's this adoption agencies and of course the organization in Arizona that is doing some of this, which are giving misinformation about the Indian Child Welfare Act. They're calling it racist and unconstitutional. And so they're putting out information that it's out there that's not accurate, that's not true. our our response to that is we're telling our story, our side, and giving them the truth. This is what the true picture is in Indian country. This is exactly what's happening in our communities, and we're having our communities tell their own stories, because that's where it's happening. You can talk about it at this level, but people will not get the full understanding of what's happening until you see it at the local levels, where, like the example I gave, where families are being split, where kids are being taken from their homes without any protection from their tribes or a means of protecting their tribes. So these things are still happening today.
So you briefly touched on one example of where it looked like this particular instance in the ICWA process was not going to unfold the way it should have, and then luckily justice was done. Are there other examples you've seen or that you know of where ICWA is followed? Mm-hmm. Not just the letter, but the spirit, and all parties involved are actually doing their due diligence to make sure that ICWA is followed, and what the positive outcome of that has been?
Well, a good example is the Baby Veronica case. At the first level, the South Carolina Supreme Court said ICWA was not followed, so they ruled in favor of the father. But it was after the appeal that it went into the Supreme Court where that decision was reversed, but it wasn't reversed on the South Carolina Supreme Court case, but on technicality. And they went back to using the act kind of just to use it to satisfy their own wishes, I guess, at the time. I'm sure there are probably cases that where the ICWA process was used and people were brought back and brought back into their communities as home. The only example I can really think about is when we had our conference this past year in Portland. One of the agenda items for our plenary session was we just brought people that experienced this process. We had one that was adopted out as early as 1 year old. Then there were others that were put up in foster homes when they were teenagers. And they told their stories about what they experienced. While some, they were put in a non-native family, which treated them well, educated them well, clothed them well. There were others that were not treated so well. They were mistreated, they were abused, and so they were just happy to come back and reunite with their tribes. And so it was sort of just them saying, I'm just knowing who I am as a tribal member of the particular tribe they are in. So there are cases that I think recently that brought kids back to their communities.
So, as we've touched on, state governments and social service agencies, court systems, and the same thing at the county level, they need to understand the law. They need to understand when they need to apply the law. But to me, there needs to be a spirit of collaboration,
right?
Correct,
exactly.
with tribal nations to make sure that that the children are properly identified and then the determinations are made whether or not they fall under ICWA. Just sort of on a more fundamental level, though, what do states and counties need to understand about tribes and their cultures and their values and their futures if they are serious about enforcing ICWA in accordance with the law's spirit?
Yeah, and I think, again, it differs from state. And I'll use New Mexico as an example because I think New Mexico, we have been involved with the state government, the different entities, and only because when Bill Richardson was the governor, we were successful in implementing a law, an act. It's called the Collaborative Act, which requires the governor's office and his cabinet to meet with the tribes on a regular yearly basis and talk about these different issues and to address the concerns of the tribes in New Mexico. But more importantly, on the health part of it, or the we have been engaging the CYFD, Children, Youth, and Families Department of New Mexico, because that's their responsibility, that department, to let the tribes know of the children being placed into adoptive home or foster homes. There's also a statute in New Mexico, which is not directly related to Indian child welfare, but what the statute says is if there is a Native youth in the system of any facility, if it's a detention home, retreatment center, or even jail, that the tribes have to be notified. You have this child in our custody, and we're letting you know that it's in this facility. That itself has not been implemented till recently, and in fact, the Indian Child Welfare Act, not the act, association, our executive director then, Terry Cross, and Jack Trope, were involved in assessing that statute to see if it was working or not working. The final report, I think, has been concluded, but the findings of that was that there needs to be ongoing developing of programs like this to inform or educate the people that are involved in this whole process. And we also, as the New Mexico Indian Child Welfare Association, again, after I left, kind of went back down, but now it's been reactivated. It's called the New Mexico Indian Child Coalition. And so they've really been active in doing training in the communities, in not just the community, but with state governments. The other important part about this whole collaborative effort, each department within state government has to have a Native liaison in their office. And so CYFD has a Native liaison, and their efforts is they hosted, I think this is probably going to be their third annual conference of Indian Child Welfare. Our problem is they're talking about states' activities, what the state is doing, but they're not including what the tribal part is doing. So now we're looking at having our own Indian Child Welfare Conference sponsored by the coalition. And of course, the training that ICWA does, that NCAI does for the organizations and state, I think is an important part. So in New Mexico, we've got this initiative. The other important part of this scenario is we have engaged the U.S. Attorney, Damian Martinez. And the reason it's important is because he reached out to the tribes. In fact, about a month ago, he had a consultation session with tribes, and this has to do with all levels of issues in law. We talked about VAWA. We talked about TLOA, the Tribal Law and Order Act. We talked about ICWA. And so the stage has been set for further discussion, further issues. So we're going to convene a meeting at 8 Northern that we're hosting. We're inviting our tribal leaders, our law enforcement, our police chief, our judges, social workers, Indian child welfare workers, could come down and put together a platform, if you will, or a document that identifies these are our issues and this is what we want you to address. So the attempts are going on constantly.
And I would imagine that's all part of a larger effort to educate the state and county counterparts that are cogs in the wheel of enforcing ICWA, right?
Right.
And isn't that an ongoing process of education, relationship building? Obviously, the liaisons is a good start, a good step towards doing that. But making sure that everyone's on the same page. That if you've got a Native child, you know where to turn. You know the right person in the tribe. You know how they identify, what processes they use, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and simply, basically, what it is: implement the law. Implement the Indian Child Welfare Act. There's a process, there's guidelines that need you to follow. And so that's the education that we're doing with our people in New Mexico. And I would like to think that whatever we develop in New Mexico, that we could replicate it and maybe send it to other governments, other tribes. The good thing developing a relationship with our U.S. Attorney is that I made a presentation to his whole staff, all his attorneys, all his workers within his office, and I made a presentation. And this was about maybe 2 years ago that I did this, and they were like, wow, we didn't know this. Wow, I didn't realize this is what was involved. So even their office, didn't have to worry with all about the Indian Child Welfare Act. So that's what we're doing. And again, like I said, it was not just Indian child welfare, it's the VAWA, it's the TLOA, and all the other things that are happening. And one of the biggest complaints by tribes of the U.S. Attorney's Office was we get a lot of case in our homes, domestic violence. But the U.S. Attorney sometimes don't take them. If it's not going to cost more than $2,000, we're not taking it. So some of these cases kind of fall through the cracks again, and so these perpetrators go free. So now we're asking that you address all the different cases that are occurring within, especially molestations, child sexual abuse, human trafficking. We're doing all that stuff now. So now we're just basically educating New Mexico or the state people about this. But the irony of this whole discussion is there are still people that are not going to listen. no matter how much it makes sense. This is the law. This is what you need to do. They're not going to adhere to it because, again, it's having to do with selling our babies.
So one of the things that has come to the fore recently, particularly in light of baby Veronica, and I would assume the momentum for this was underway before that, but are these new regulations that are being formulated to put some more teeth into ICWA and to really compel all of the parties at the table to follow the law, to consistently enforce the law. How do you see these new regulations? How do you see them strengthening ICWA, and how do you see them strengthening compliance?
I think we're going in the right direction, and the consultations that took place with Kevin Washburn, Assistant Secretary throughout Indian country on the guidelines itself, I think there were more positive response versus the negative responses, and so I think that's a step forward. Again, it's incumbent on us to make sure that these regulations are applied to the Indian Child Welfare Act for it to be more successful. Again, you're going to have the proponents that are saying, no, this like the Goldwater Institute, the adoption agencies that saying it's a racist act, it's unconstitutional. They're going to continue to do this. So our battle is going to continue, but it's our efforts to educate our people, especially our tribal leaders, and I think that's what we're doing here at NCAI, letting our tribal leaders really understand the seriousness of the threat of the Indian child welfare. And I'm continually telling tribal leadership, and I can tell them that because I'm a tribal leader myself, so to let them know we need to take positions, we need to pass resolutions, but not stop there. We need to develop relationships with all the organizations that are out there, especially the U.S. attorneys in the state, so that they can file a amicus brief to support us. And I think this effort of developing this relationship is not just for the Indian Child Welfare Act, but all the other issues that are out there that we need to have some collaborative effort with the organization and tribes, and to take a strong position, because it is the threat of losing our kids.
So to combat that threat, obviously there's the policy fight, there's the legal fight, and then there's the fight for public opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And there's obviously a variety of strategies and tactics that you can employ. But isn't one of the strongest strategies or tactics to really convey the personal story, the personal price that is exacted when this act is not followed,
right?
And put a human face,
right?
Put a human face to that,
right? And from the start, from baby Veronica, the public view that was put out there was put out by the proponents of Indian child welfare. So their story was out there, front page. Newspapers are still telling that same story even after the baby Veronica case. And so it's important that you're correct, that we tell the true stories. Like I said, you don't understand the case until you hear from the communities of how many kids were lost from their pueblo, their tribes, how many kids were put in homes out of their without going through the process. So that's what we need to do. We need to bring those stories up, and that's our what we're doing here, the activity, telling our story, setting the record straight. I think is what we're saying, setting the record straight, telling the true story, telling exactly what the Indian Child Welfare Act is about and what its intentions were. And so the hope that the process with the guidelines and everything is going in that direction. But I think the education, for me, is sort of where I'm coming from, educating not just our tribal leaders, but educating our state legislators, our people within state government, and then taking that and take it to the next level.
So one final question, a follow-up question on that. Obviously, NCWA has a role to play in telling that story. NCAI has a role to play in telling that story, and the two organizations work with one another to do that and fight the fight. Isn't there a role, though, for individual tribes who've experienced the negative consequences of the act not being enforced? Their leadership, the people in social services, to document those stories and then share them out, to create a pipeline, if you will, to the national organizations that can fight that battle on their behalf.
That's exactly what needs to happen. But I'll give you a scenario though. Social service and in child welfare are funded by the federal government. And a lot of times when you get federal dollars, they're restricted to the activity. There are guidelines, there's rules, this is how you can do it, this is what you can do. So sometimes our social services and our Indian child welfare programs are limited as to what they do because of what funding source they're coming from. But I think the important part of that the departments though is to tell the story because they're the ones that are in the front lines. They're the ones that are seeing the kids being removed from homes. They're the ones that are in the courthouse, the courtrooms, and fighting for those kids. And it's probably from the I have not been there a lot, but the times that I've been there, it's frustrating when a judge is sitting up there and he's actually making his decision based on his opinion, his or her opinion of what the law is. And that's the frustrating part. So that's why it's important to tell those stories, or even those cases where the case was not the proper decision that the court judges or the courts made.
And it isn't part of that, telling that story is just to convey to the judges in many cases, policymakers, that it is in fact in the best interests of a Native child to remain in a Native community, to remain in a Native family, and it's up to us to define what that best interest is.
And that's I guess the important part of the act is the best interest part. But again, going back to Baby Veronica case, when they reversed it back to the South Carolina case, they told them don't use this clause, don't use the best interest part in this case. And of course they used the part where since the baby was never with the father to begin with, that's what they used. He never really had no connection with the child from the beginning, so that's what the decision was made to put it. And of course by that time, the father was also tired and the things that her daughter was being put through. And so I guess the outcome was that he does have visitation rights. Of course, the baby Veronica, when he turns 18, it's her own decision where she wants to go.
Well, Gil, we really appreciate you taking some time to share your thoughts and experience and wisdom with us on this critical topic, and good luck in the struggle. Yeah,
I just want to add one more thing. When you were asking me about my tribe, we were successful in getting a grant from the, I think it was A&A grant on social and economic development strategies, and it's our project was the Family Wellness Project, and it's got a little story about some of the things that we did. One of the important part of it was to update our codes that we have in Tesuque, and the inclusion of children's code. We had a children's code, but we updated that. We involved persons at risk code, not just the youth, but adults, elderly. And so this funding did allow us to train our own people to become part of the solution rather than be the problem. So that's one of the initiatives that we're taking part in Tesuque. But I think all the other communities, tribes are looking in that direction, but it takes funding to do that.
It is an expensive process. But you raise a good point. I mean, it's not just the tribal struggle to make sure that ICWA is a force is not just external, right? There's an internal component in that we as a tribe need to look at our laws, look at our codes, and make sure that we're doing absolutely everything in our own power, according to our own laws, to make sure that ICWA is enforced.
Right. And the important part of the conference yesterday at the general session, when we were asked what changes would you like to see in your communities, our table said we need to preserve our language and because without language we cannot have culture or tradition, and that's really important. So I think that's what we're talking about here with this project is teaching our language to our children. Even that has changed throughout the years. We teach our language. I learned my language through my family. It was just an everyday dialogue that we talked because that was our language. I didn't learn English till probably when I was 6, 7 years old. Today that has changed because of many reasons. Intermarriages, there's got to be communication that's done in English. So we've been losing the languages these few years, but now we're coming back to teach that language. Of course, it's a different style. We're writing it in now. We have it written language. Our language are not written language, they're descriptive. So it's hard to write in alphabetical purposes. So these are some of the things that are happening also. That's going to address Indian child welfare. It's going to address our alcohol drug problem. It's going to address all the issues that our kids are confronted with today.
Well, Gil, again, we appreciate it and good luck.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have on today's episode of Sovereignty in Action, a program of the National Congress of American Indians. To learn more about Sovereignty in Action, please visit NCAI's website at www.ncai.org. Thank you for joining us. Copyright 2015, National Congress of American Indians.